You can spot them by the square and compass, a symbol that represents one of history's oldest, most mysterious brotherhoods. The Freemasons. Even with over 2 million members, Freemasons have managed to hold tight their many secrets. They've built their order on legends from the Bible, and they engage in intriguing ceremonies.
We perform rituals that can seem strange or even esoteric at times. It's that mysteriousness that fascinates people.
Since their founding in the 18th century, the Freemasons and their arcane rules have stirred controversy and fear. The clergy have accused them of worshiping Satan. Others have blamed them for the French Revolution.
Freemasonry was one of those underground networks where republicanism refused to die.
Some people remain convinced they're part of a plot for world domination. They have been threatened with excommunication by the Vatican, persecuted by Nazis and Soviets during World War II, and banned by the Vichy regime.
Hundreds of people died because they were Freemasons. There had never been such a persecution before in the history of Freemasonry in France.
How did the Freemasons get their sinister reputation? Who are they really, and what sort of secrets are they sworn to protect? To find out, we spoke to Freemasons from France and England who agreed to give us an insider's view of their lodge operations. Join us as we learn about the incredible history of this centuries-old secret society and investigate these thinkers who have remained in the shadows, changing history and inspiring more conspiracy theories than ever before. The Freemasons. Paris. Just steps away from the opera, in the heart of one of the capital city's liveliest neighborhoods, the 16 Rue Cadet, lies a strange building, a Masonic temple. Behind these walls is the oldest Grand Lodge on French territory, the Grand Orient de France. Inside, visitors are plunged into an array of dimly lit reading rooms, libraries, and meeting rooms. The brothers, as they call themselves, come here to think, study, and talk about the problems of the world and the major issues facing society today. The Grand Orient de France comprises more than 50,000 members from a wide range of backgrounds and professions. They embrace the values of brotherhood, freedom of conscience, and humanism.
The idea is that when you walk through the door of the Grand Orient, you leave behind the habits of the secular world, as we call it, and walk into a kind of secret garden, a preserved space. We call it an order. And like any order, it has a traditional structure, a way of doing things, and a certain number of rules.
Freemasonry is much more than a place for people to gather and talk. It's an order, a term directly inspired by the knightly orders of the Middle Ages, and it has a strict hierarchy and set of rules. The heart of it all is the lodge. Each lodge brings together a small number of brothers for local meetings. Several lodges combined form a Masonic obedience, a community of members who share the same values and are led by a Grand Master. There are 22 of these in France. There can be some rivalry between them. Some are Christian, while others have no religious affiliation, but all subscribe to the precepts of Freemasonry. Among them are the main French obediences whose headquarters are located in Paris, the Grand Orient, the Grande Loge de France, and the Grande Loge Nationale Française. France features over 3,000 lodges, with some 175,000 members. There are an estimated 2 to 4 million members around the world on 5 continents. the Freemasons have been a source of fascination ever since the creation of the first lodges in the 18th century, thanks to their mysterious symbols, secret rituals, and influential members, some of whom prefer to remain anonymous. Their fiercest detractors assert that the Freemasons are nothing more than a cult that wants to force its way of thinking on the rest of the world. So, how did a movement that promotes the universal values of equality and fraternity and recruits members from every rank of society become the target of so much hate and suspicion? Undoubtedly, in part, because Freemasonry is built on a scaffolding of secrets and rituals that are mysterious, to say the least.
We perform rituals that can seem strange, obscure, or even esoteric at times. It's that mysteriousness that fascinates people. We consider ourselves to be an initiatory society. What that means is that if someone wants to join the group so they can grow intellectually, spiritually, and socially, they must first be initiated. And that initiation takes the form of a ritual.
Whenever people come together or hold a meeting somewhere, and they close the doors to make sure no one else can see what's happening, it creates a sense of something being forbidden. Anything that's forbidden automatically attracts speculation.
The principle of confidentiality among Freemasons is built on a promise to respect what another says. You cannot repeat anything that was said inside the temple or during a ritual outside that context. And that's for one very simple reason, so we can have complete trust in one another and speak freely. To us, confidentiality is a guarantee of freedom of expression.
Let's visit the seat of one of the three largest Masonic obediences on French territory, the Grande Loge de France. It's located in Paris's 17th arrondissement. We're not allowed to film the facade of the building, nor to reveal the exact address. Jeremy is the chief archivist of the Grande Loge de France. Today, for the first time, he has been given special permission to tell us what happens during a meeting of his obedience.
The Freemasons wear white gloves and an apron when they arrive. There are several types of aprons representing different ranks and positions within the temple.
Every Masonic temple follows the same basic principles. The layout is a symbolic reference to the Temple of Solomon, which was built in 1000 BC by King Solomon and is mentioned in the Old Testament as the place where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, the wooden chest covered in gold containing the tablets of the law. Inside is a rectangular room with no windows, oriented from west to east. On either side of the entrance are two columns called Jachin and Boaz, named after the bronze columns on either side of the main entrance of the Temple of Solomon. Each side of the temple has a name. The side with the door is the west. At the other end of the temple is the east. To the left is the north, and to the right is the south. The floor is made of a mosaic of black and white tiles symbolizing the duality of good and evil, light and shadow. To the east is an elevated platform with 3 steps. In the middle, facing west, is where sits the worshipful master, the president of the lodge. To the north sits the secretary, and to the south sits the orator.
Once the Freemasons have entered the temple, they move into position. There are several positions in the temple, depending on your rank as an apprentice, fellow craft, or master. Then the officers come in. The officers stand on what we call a stage, and they're the leaders of the lodge on a symbolic level, and in terms of overseeing the rituals and managing the lodge in general. Then we can begin what we call our work. First, the worshipful master performs a ceremony to make our time here sacred. What we Freemasons call sacred time is working time. We ask one brother to move to the area known as the East to read a work, which we call a plate. A plate is a written text that interprets a given symbol. It can be the triangle, the sun, or the moon. It can also be about a topic in society. We also discuss more complicated subjects, such as transhumanism. There are no real limits.
The rituals of Freemasonry are often criticized or even mocked. Yet they're the result of a long tradition, inspired by the first stone-cutting guilds in Scotland and England. That's where the name Freemason comes from.
The word Freemason dates back to the Middle Ages. On medieval building sites, there were always stonecutters and certain people in particular who were very fine sculptors. They didn't work with just any stone. They needed very delicate limestone with a fine grain, which lent itself to more sophisticated work. This was known as freestone because it's free to be worked into delicate sculptures. The masons who carved freestone were known as freestone masons, which was eventually shortened to Freemasons.
By the 11th century, the first Freemasons started forming brotherhoods and gathering in lodges to perform rituals together. 1390 marked the publication of the first manuscript, the Regis Poem, which was a text written by an unknown author that laid out for the first time a set of rules for all Freemasons to follow. It was succeeded 30 years later by the Cook manuscript. These two texts, which are considered to be the foundation of operative Freemasonry, were the first in a series of 130 documents known as the Old Charges. They describe how the Builders Guild functioned and talk about the myths of Masonry work. After a while, these early Freemasons decided to start accepting outsiders into their brotherhood.
Starting at the very end of the 16th century and throughout the 17th, Masonic lodges decided to embrace an old idea called acceptance. Professional organizations used to allow certain accepted people to join, which is to say people who did not work in the trade, but might be important clients, or the local reverend or pastor, for example. In Scotland in the 17th century, and in Great Britain on a larger scale, these guilds started recruiting more and more outsiders until some were made up entirely of accepted people. This marked the emergence of a new kind of Freemasonry that included members who were no longer stonemasons by trade, but rather notable figures, or gentlemen masons, as they would call them at the time.
And when operative Freemasonry became what we call speculative Freemasonry, which was no longer focused on creating physical structures, but rather intellectual, moral, and spiritual ones, they referred to the highest-ranking workers on any building site, which were, of course, Freemasons. Today, Elias Ashmole is considered to have been one of the first speculative Freemasons. The antiques dealer and politician was initiated in 1645 in the town of Warrington in northwestern England. It was here, in the small city with a population of 200,000, that one of the oldest Masonic lodges in history was built in the 18th century. Until then, members had been meeting in the local taverns. Tombs have been found with symbols carved into them to show that the person belonged to the group of Freemasons. David Harrison is a historian and archaeologist who specializes in Freemasons and is himself a master of the Grand Lodge of England.
This is St Elphin's Church, the oldest church in Warrington, dates back to the early medieval period. The lodge actually met just down the road down there. This is the Masonic monument of William Hunt, who was a local doctor in Warrington, and he was a member of the Lodge of Lights. He died in 1854, and here he is, his mortal remains, with Masonic symbols that all tie in nicely. We have the square and compass over there, the plum, and the six-pointed star, the Star of David, or Solomon's Star. We have the all-seeing eye, which is obviously one of the most prominent symbols that captures the conspiracy theories. So it's a beautiful array of symbols.
A mix of religious references and everyday stone-cutting tools, these engravings depict many of the symbols that the new Freemasons appropriated for themselves.
This is the gravestone of Charles Wainwright, who died in 1851. He was a Freemason. We've got the square and compass again, the all-seeing eye. We've got the sun, we've got the moon, 7 stars around the moon. These are common Masonic symbols.
On the other side of the cemetery is an even more unusual tomb.
This is the Masonic gravestone of my great-great-great-uncle, Henry Harrison. He died in 1844. There's a Masonic code along the arch there. The code is actually pigpen cipher, which was normally the common cipher for Masonic correspondence. It means, glory to God on high. When Freemasons visited this grave, they knew what that meant. So again, you know, we're talking about secrecy, we're talking about codes. This is the themes that we can relate to Freemasonry. People at that period would be able to recognize that and would be able to recognize the symbols, and they'd know immediately what it meant and that Henry was a Freemason.
The symbols carved into the tombs in Warrington are found in every Masonic temple. They're omnipresent on the walls, clothing, objects, and posters. Today, they're recognized around the world as symbols of the Freemasons. But there's no one single meaning for any of them. Each individual member is free to interpret them as they see fit, according to their own philosophy or beliefs.
The most important symbols for me would be the square and compass. That obviously can be translated basically that all brethren are on the square or on the level as well. The compass is obviously a tool of precision, which was used in engineering and used in natural philosophy. We can use the compass to create a circle. So there we've got one of the most essential symbols for a human being, you know, the cycle of life. We traverse this pathway again, life, death, rebirth. The skull and crossbones is a very old symbol. We're talking about morality and mortality. Morality in the way that, you know, you can lead a good life, and when you're dead, you can die a happy man. And mortality, it reminds us that one day we are going to be bare bones, you know.
The large triangle with an eye in the middle and rays coming out of it is called the Shining Delta, or the Eye of Providence, and it represents what we call the great architect of the universe. The great architect of the universe can be God for people who believe in God, or something else like some sort of universal consciousness or the laws of physics or even universal laws.
Among the Freemasons, each individual symbol is cause for reflection. For some people, the plumb line represents moral uprightness, while for others it represents a search for perfection. The pentagram, or blazing star, can be interpreted as a symbol of harmony or the image of an initiate shining among the shadows.
Another symbol is the hex alpha, a six-pointed star. The six-pointed star is formed by placing one triangle upright and the other triangle upside down. The one triangle points towards heaven, the other triangle points towards the earth, but you can't extricate them. Heaven and earth, the macrocosm and the microcosm, are one. It's something for the non-material side of ourselves. It's something that we need to do in order to nourish our spiritual existence. We have another symbol, which is a point in the center of a circle and two parallel lines either side. The point at the center of the circle is that place where I go to know myself and to be with myself and to understand myself and find my own divine light in myself. Once I've discovered that, I can go out to the circumference of the circle around it and be with the rest of humanity. But I have to know myself first. That's a very powerful allegory.
Symbolism is simply another way of saying something. It becomes a language of its own, like a private language that only the Freemasons understand.
These symbols, clothing, and rituals have become the trademark of the Freemasons, like the enigmatic handshake used by members to recognize one another.
Every trade, stonemasons, bakers, shoemakers, leather workers, hat makers, every one of these trades had their own handshake, but they have disappeared. Freemasonry is the only one that's left. 400 years ago, everyone had a special handshake. That was not unusual. It's only unusual today because we're the last ones using it.
So you can't show me your handshake?
No, because you're not a member.
You kind of use it automatically. When I was first shown it, I was still a bit unsure. That's way back in my late 20s. Obviously, when you settle in and you become a regular Freemason and you see it done many, many times and then you get involved in the ritual in the lodge, you're doing it without even knowing it. You're doing it subconsciously.
The Freemasons have inherited age-old practices. The traces of the first lodges with members who were not stonecutters were found in Scotland and in small English towns in the 17th century. But it was London that would be the backdrop for one of the most important moments in the history of modern Freemasonry, the creation of the first Grand Masonic Lodge, an event that remains shrouded in mystery even today.
In the first few years of the 18th century, there were several Masonic lodges in London alone. Between 1717 and 1721, 4 lodges came together to form one Grand Lodge, which had never been done before. These lodges, for which one of the main purposes was mutual solidarity, thought they could benefit from coming together. They also hoped to be able to appoint a high-ranking nobleman as their Grand Master. This very modest assembly of working-class people came together in 1721 with a Grand Master who was none other than John Montagu, the second Duke of Montagu, who was very close to the king and also one of the richest men in England at the time. Naturally, he made a massive donation to the Grand Lodge's coffers.
John Montagu, the second Duke of Montagu, was also a member of the Royal Society of London, an institution that was established in 1660 to promote science and included some of the most prestigious members of English society at the time.
Within a few years, the social structure of London's lodges underwent a dramatic transformation. Aristocrats, military officials, and whole cartloads of Royal Society members started joining the lodges. Then, the new dignitaries of this Grand Lodge came up with the idea of forming a grand organization that would unite, lead, manage, and organize the life of the lodges. To that end, they would need rules. That's why they asked the son of a Scottish Mason who had been living in London for a few years, Reverend James Anderson, first to write a new version of the history of the Mason trade, drawing inspiration from the old charges, and second, to write up a set of rules that will be applied in all lodges moving forward. Over the years, more and more lodges started springing up and joining the Grand Lodge, so the idea clearly had appeal, and it confirmed Freemasonry as a global phenomenon. Just 4 years later, Freemasonry was established in Paris. 10 years later, there were lodges all over Europe.
The first Freemasons in France were British exiles who opposed the new King of England.
Many of them moved to the area around Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a wealthy Parisian suburb. We're talking about some 30 to 50,000 people, most of whom never returned to England. And some of them were Freemasons. Since they were already used to practicing Freemasonry, they continued doing so in Paris.
The first Masonic lodge in Paris met in the home of an English caterer in the Saint-Germain area. Their leader was Charles Radcliffe, Earl of Derwentwater, who strongly opposed the King of England and would be decapitated in London in 1746 because of his political activity. At the time, the philosophy of the Enlightenment was spreading across Europe, and the Masonic ideals appealed to many free thinkers.
When Freemasonry reached France in 1720, we know it started out in the upper class. But it quickly moved from featuring only high-ranking aristocrats in the first lodges to having a much more diverse population, ranging from tradesmen to public officials to shopkeepers. Freemasonry experienced rapid growth in the 18th century.
There was just one lodge in all of France in 1725, in Paris. By 1737, there were 6 in Paris and just as many in other parts of France. Freemasonry was growing quickly, but it was also starting to attract criticism and awake suspicion. One of their detractors was one of the most important figures at the time, Pope Clement XII.
Clement XII was the head of the Roman Catholic Church, and he had a very negative view of Freemasonry. Why? Because it was secret and he didn't know what was going on. That's always very dangerous for people in power. It also supported a kind of relativism of religions, which is to say that all religions were equal. That idea went completely against what the Pope was conveying at the time. It's important to know that back then, there were many Freemasons who were Catholic, including priests, vicars, and bishops, because it was a different way of thinking. I think that really resonated with educated people.
On April 28, 1738, Clement XII issued a papal bull titled In Eminenti Apostolatis Specula. The text clearly stated that Catholics were forbidden to be part of the Society of Liberi Moratori, which was Latin for Freemasons, and that anyone who broke this rule would be excommunicated.
The papal bull of excommunication issued by Clement XII had an effect in Portugal, Spain, and Italy, where the Inquisition was able to put it into action. But it had no effect in France for one very simple legal reason. In France, no act issued by the Pope could be applied to French Catholics unless it had first been accepted by the Parliament in Paris. But it was such a minor, unimportant issue that the king's government decided it didn't deserve their attention. So Parliament refused to accept the papal bull excommunicating Freemasons. That's why, despite the excommunication of 1738, for legal reasons, Freemasonry was free to continue growing and developing in this Catholic country.
In the 18th century, a number of prestigious figures became Freemasons. Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Lalande in France. Mozart and Haydn in Austria. Goethe in Germany. And Benjamin Franklin and George Washington in the United States. The number of lodges was constantly growing as progressive ideas inspired by the Enlightenment philosophy spread around the world.
Freemasonry gradually became a vector for the liberal, democratic sociability that took root in the 18th century and came into its own during the French Revolution.
In 1789, the French Revolution broke out. This event fundamentally changed the country by putting an end to the monarchy and replacing it with the First Republic. The revolution brought its share of terror with it as well. It was also during this time that certain opponents of revolutionary ideas went looking for people to blame for the chaos that reigned in French society at the time. They quickly found a target: the Freemasons.
When you look at the lodges that survived into the revolution, most of the time they're reacting to the revolution just like everybody else is. They're very, very surprised. They are shocked in some cases. Most of the time they're very supportive of the king until he flees in 1791. Before, in banquets, the first toast was always to the king, and that goes away completely. I think we should kind of ask the question the other way around, not what role the Freemasons played in the French Revolution, but how did the French Revolution influence Masonic sociability? The French Revolution is a watershed moment in the history of Freemasonry in the French context.
The French Revolution fundamentally changed the practices of Freemasons in France, and the makeup of the lodges changed as well.
First, nearly all the aristocrats disappeared. All that remained was the petite bourgeoisie, which remains dominant in lodges even today. There was also a rise in the members belonging to certain professions that are still overrepresented in Freemasonry nowadays. Doctors, lawyers, professors, and sometimes policemen. In the 19th century, being a lawyer was often synonymous with being a supporter of progressive ideas. And in the 19th century, doctors were often known for being very moderate in terms of religion, if not hostile to it.
Faced with these changes within the Masonic lodges, Napoleon Bonaparte, who had taken power in France and would later become Napoleon I, understood that the Freemasons could be a powerful ally. Napoleon did everything he could to support the Freemasons. Nearly every member of his family was initiated into the order. His brother Joseph even became the Grand Master of the Grand Orient of France. Many of his most important ministers, such as the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Police, along with the highest-ranking members of his army, were also Freemasons. Everywhere Napoleon I conquered new territories, members of his family took power. And with them, new Masonic lodges were founded.
As the First Empire expanded across Europe under Napoleon, Freemasonry spread at the same time and supported his cause because they believed that he was best positioned to give the Freemasons a positive reputation. They even published a map of the French Masonic Empire at the time.
After the fall of Napoleon, France was ruled by a succession of political regimes. As the monarchy gave way to the Second Republic, which was itself replaced by the Second Empire, the Freemasons continued to meet and discuss how society was changing in the privacy of their lodges.
Freemasonry became very much associated with what you could call oppositional republicanism, because all of the Republicans who were destroyed by Napoleon III in 1851 had to go underground. And Freemasonry was one of those underground networks where republicanism refused to die. Many Republicans recognized the value of the Masonic network from just a tangible, practical point of view as an organization that they could diffuse their message.
The only place where they were safe was at Masonic gatherings. So Freemasonry became a sort of Republican party in everything but name. Lodge meetings started to resemble political meetings more and more. So when the Republic was proclaimed, many leaders of the Republican movement and therefore the new regime were already Freemasons.
In just a few years, the Third Republic of France would see a veritable Masonic takeover of the French political landscape. Jules Ferry, Léon Gambetta, Émile Combes, Jules Simon, Arthur Grossier, Léon Bourgeois, Paul Dumas. Freemasons had some of the most influential positions in this new government.
Between 1875 and 1914, more than 200 of the nearly 500 deputies in the Chamber of Deputies were Freemasons. In 1896, 7 out of 11 ministers were Freemasons. Paul Dumas, the Minister of France, was also the Secretary General of the Grand Orient at the same time.
Within just a few years, the Freemasons were massively overrepresented in the political machinery. By the end of the 19th century, there were tens of thousands of Freemasons in France, and approximately 30% of political officials were Freemasons. So, yes, in a way, Freemasons had taken power.
Free, secular, compulsory education, divorce, freedom of the press, freedom of association, the first labor code. Dozens of laws that are still valid today were introduced by politicians who were also Freemasons. This power started to inspire a new, visceral wave of anti-Freemason sentiment in certain political opponents.
Education was the privilege of the church. Any attack on the church's education of the masses meant that the churches and Catholic temples would one day be deserted forever. Based on that, the Catholics started to believe that the Freemasons were part of a massive, complex conspiracy to destroy everything.
Anti-Masonic sentiment reached a fever pitch at this point. There was a form of war between two Frances. The right-wing, conservative, Catholic France, which considered itself more or less the right hand of the church at the time, and the left-wing, Republican, progressive France, which, it must be said, was also heavily influenced by Freemasonry.
This conflict between the two Frances became increasingly tense. One man pushed anti-Masonic sentiment to the extreme. Léo Taxil, a writer who was prepared to do anything to make a name for himself, even make up false evidence to influence public opinion.
Leo Taxil was a former Freemason turncoat who became anti-Masonic and published books where he explained or revealed, as he said, what happened in the lodges. The books were full of nonsense. He even went so far as to say that on Fridays, after the Masonic ritual, the devil would appear. But he didn't appear in his usual form. No, he appeared in the form of a crocodile and played the piano. It's completely absurd.
Leo Taxil published 14 eloquently titled books in which he attributed all kinds of deviant practices to the Freemasons. His books were translated into English and were a great success all over Europe.
And there were people who believed him, thousands of them. Finally, he held a large press conference at the Société de Géographie in Paris, where he revealed that it was all a sham, and that he had been lying to everyone. But what's interesting is not just the analysis of Leo Taxil's monstrous lies, which had gone on for more than 10 years, but also the fact that so many people in the general public were prepared to believe such an aberration. That's how bad things had gotten.
Leo Taxil finished out his life writing cookbooks and died in relative obscurity. But today, he's still considered one of the most famous writers of fake news in all of history. After his books were published, the Freemasons started receiving more and more serious accusations.
We were accused of all kinds of unthinkable things, such as murdering children and raping virgins on the Masonic altar. And that was when a number of complicated conspiracy theories started to appear, mixing Freemasonry up with anti-Semitic society. Why the amalgam between Freemasonry and the Jewish religion, considering that there weren't many Jewish people in the first lodges? Because we're the heirs of the builders of the Temple of Solomon. So some people thought there must have been Jews in the Freemasons, hence the leap. And there was talk of a Judeo-Masonic plot to take over the world and subjugate it to the financial powers.
In 1903, a work entitled The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was published in Russia. It contained numerous accounts of some 20 so-called secret meetings in which Freemasons and Jews were plotting to take over the world through manipulation, war, and revolutions.
In theory, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion explains that the highest-ranking authorities in Israel and the Jewish community had come up with a Machiavellian plan to gain influence over the world, and that the lodges were one part of that Machiavellian plan to control the world.
This book, which was translated into numerous languages and sold around the world, quickly became a bestseller. Except that the elements presented in it turned out to be entirely made up. Several historians proved that it was almost entirely plagiarized from an 1864 text written by Maurice Joly entitled Dialogue in Hell between Machiavelli and Montesquieu, a satirical pamphlet intended to denounce a fictional plan of Napoleon III to take over the world. When you compare the text of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion with that of Maurice Joly, which predated the Russian book by nearly 40 years, there are dozens of examples of the same themes, the same wordings, and even, in some places, the same exact sentences. Even though the fraud was quickly revealed in newspapers, the work continued to be used by supporters of the Judeo-Masonic conspiracy, such as Italian and Spanish fascists, and even Hitler himself, who used the theories of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion for his propaganda department in the Third Reich. Today, despite dozens of works dedicated to researching the text, the origins of this book remain a mystery. But its wild claims are still supported by certain conspiracy theorists.
The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is fake. But it was so successful that it didn't even matter that it was made up. The book was intended to create a link between the Jewish plot to take over the world with that of Freemasons, because, of course, one fantasy naturally feeds another, and the same goes for conspiracies. By finding links between all the different conspiracies, you can create one massive global conspiracy theory. It offers a simple explanation for a complicated world, believing there are people in the background pulling the strings and that they're the true world leaders. These lies have now been published in every language on a massive scale, including online.
The rise of dictatorships in Europe marked the beginning of a dark age for Freemasons. All over the continent, lodges were persecuted and even forced to close.
The Bolsheviks seized power.
The Soviet regime dealt the Freemasons a crushing blow. Trotsky even said Freemasonry is an infected wound on the body of French aristocracy. It must be burned with a red-hot iron. As for the fascist governments in Italy and Germany, they wiped out their country's lodges in a matter of years.
In 1940, after France surrendered to Nazi Germany, it was the Vichy regime's turn to take on the Freemasons.
The first Vichy law was to forbid secret societies, and when they said secret societies, they meant the Freemasons. After that, Masonic obediences started being dissolved. Their buildings and goods were confiscated, and their archives were pillaged. A number of files that included membership lists were confiscated, and the names of Freemasons were published in the press. Many of them, who were public servants, were fired, showing that the regime also wanted to humiliate them. They staged an anti-Masonic exhibition that was presented in Paris around the country with macabre images showing Freemasons in a particularly dark, threatening light.
As part of their anti-Masonic propaganda, the Vichy regime even directed a film called Occult Forces. The purpose of it was clear: to depict Freemasonry in the darkest possible light for public viewing.
The film was directed, thought up, and staged by people who were former Masons, so it was the first time a Masonic ritual of the time was shown on a movie screen. Our Masonic ceremonies haven't changed since then. The ritual it's shown is completely accurate. It's troubling because it had been kept almost entirely secret until then. But after the release of the film, for the first time, people could see what Freemasons did in their lodges.
More than 50 minutes long, the film included all kinds of stereotypes about Freemasons scattered throughout, along with extreme caricatures. The secret handshake that only members know. The belief that the French Parliament was infected by the omnipresence of Freemasons, and their influence on the financial system and within the army. Similar to the theories put forth in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, published 40 years earlier, the film referenced a Judeo-Masonic plan to manipulate the public authority and the population. It asserted that the Freemasons were directly responsible for World War II, which it claimed was merely one step in their Machiavellian plan for world domination.
To find the origins of the conspiracy, which for them clearly explained France's surrender to Nazi Germany in 1940, they needed someone to blame. And obviously, they settled on the Freemasons.
During the many years of occupation, the persecution of Freemasons led by the Vichy regime and Nazi occupiers was incredibly effective.
Hundreds of people died because they were Freemasons. They were deported, shot, and imprisoned in challenging conditions. There had never been a persecution like that before in the history of Freemasonry in France. That left a lasting trace on Masonic memory.
After the war, General de Gaulle gave the Masonic lodges back their rights. But there was lasting trauma. There were 30,000 Freemasons before the war, and only 5,000 remained in 1945. After these years of terror, the presence of Freemasons in the political sphere dropped significantly. Today, more than 75 years after the end of World War II, Freemasonry has been transformed. It's more transparent and open to the public in an effort to counter the image of a mysterious cult, which some people still believe it to be. It was long forbidden to women, but now it's open to both genders in many countries and has opened the door to new categories of members.
Freemasonry has survived 3 centuries of upheaval. The French Revolution, the empires, industrialization, and great dogmas such as communism, fascism, neoliberalism, and postmodernity. I don't think Freemasonry will ever die. Freemasonry is 300 years old. That's a strength, but it could also be a weakness if we refuse to change, if Freemasonry refused to adapt to the realities of today. But I think that Freemasonry has existed for 300 years precisely because it knows how to adapt.
What will Masonic lodges look like in the future? What will be their spheres of influence and their power over society, politics, and the evolution of the world in the decades to come? It's impossible to answer these questions with any certainty. But one thing's for sure. The symbol of the square and compass will remain ever present in the temples of this secret society that has survived throughout the centuries.